Everybody has probably dealing with the issues around agriculture and climate change. And perhaps one of the worst evenings I've had in a long time was on December the 2nd, 2006. I remember very well because I spent the evening with the group of scientists in the consultative group on international agricultural research in Washington. These are the Green Revolution guys. They spent the day talking about climate change and the future of agriculture in Asia and Africa and Latin America. But what they've been saying and talking about, I even heard it this week in a meeting with the World Bank on Tuesday, where the operational assumption of the Green Revolution folks, the operational assumption of the World Bank is that climate change is going to be so devastating for agriculture, so devastating, particularly for tropical and subtropical regions. The best that can be done, we take all the poor farmers, all the so-called marginalized farmers, get them on buses and drive them to the city. The assumption was that all that's going to be able to be done to save the food system with climate change is they're going to be able to focus on 3 or 4 major crops. You know which ones they are. In the major growing areas, which is the prairies, the plains, the Punjab, and the Pampas. Focus on those areas, grow as much food as we can with the biggest farmers we can find, and hopefully get through climate change. They were saying that the figure now is, the official figure I'm told, is that in terms of how many hungry people are there on the planet, the answer is 1 billion and 2 million. So 1.002 million people. And that's up from 830 million before the food crisis began. And the bank says that 70% of those people live in rural areas of the hungry. So over 700 million people who are hungry in marginal lands, marginal areas, they say. Well, the figures are strange. If we just follow through here, sorry to give you so much data over dinner, but there's 450 million farms, we're told. 382 million of those farms are smallholder farms, again, 2 hectares or less around the world. They have somewhere, depending on who you want to believe, between 1.5 and 2 billion people living in those farms. But half of the world's people are still in rural areas. So the world population, there's 3.3 billion people out there. There's about 1.3 billion at least living in rural areas who aren't eating, who actually are getting fed. 700 million of them are hungry, not getting enough. But another 600 million at least are getting enough. And who's feeding the 700 million that don't get enough? Well, it's not Walmart. It's not Monsanto. They're not there. They're not in those areas. If we look at who is feeding the hungry today, it's peasant farmers. They're the only ones. They're doing the 382 million farms. They're out there. They're getting their surplus, taking care of themselves as best they can, not always well enough for themselves even, but still feeding their neighbors. And the World Bank and the Green Revolution guys have the absolute God-given nerve to say, you got to get them to the city? Then who's going to feed the hungry then? If they're gone, the World Food Program feeds, 100 million people a year, partially. That's all. They're mostly in the cities. So, if they're saying they're going to give them bus tickets to go to the city, the farmers, the small farmers, no one's going to be left to feed anybody else. So we're going to have an exacerbated, much worse food crisis than we have today. So the task then, for any sane human being looking at the food crisis we're in, is to say, we've got to get more support to allow more innovation, more resiliency in those 382 million farms. They're the ones that are going to get those other people through the crisis ahead of us. And it's going to be tough. There's no question climate change is real and it's miserable. Something's going to have to be done. But they're the backbone that's going to do that. But if you talk to the bank again, the World Bank says, well, we just got to focus on the major crops and the big farmers. Well, the big farmers are the ones that are selling to the cities, not to the rural areas. They're saying that's where the innovation's got to be. Well, where the hell do you think the innovation is? I mean, look at the figures. Since the beginning of patenting of plant varieties, since the beginning of plant breeders' rights and plant variety protection, since the 60s, the best estimate is there's about 150,000 plant varieties probably since over the last almost 50 years. 150,000. Sounds pretty impressive. They even brag about it. They don't remember that a huge percentage of that is actually roses, chrysanthemums, African violets, and carnations. The amount of that is actually food that's actually critical for the lives of hungry people is very small. But by comparison to that, let's look at the CGIR system, the Green Revolution guys. Well, over that same time period, they produced 8,000 plant varieties in total. That can sound impressive. They brag about it in the brochures. What have small farmers done over that same time period? They produced 1.9 million plant varieties, unique plant varieties. And they've donated, they haven't patented any of them, they've donated them to gene banks around the world. There's 7 million accessions to the gene banks, 1.9 million are unique accessions provided by farmers. Not duplicated anywhere. That's what they've done. In the future, we're going to rely upon these guys that can breed roses and chrysanthemums, and some soybeans and some maize, a couple other crops, to feed the world. We're going to rely upon the farmers that have actually brought that massive creativity in the 382 million laboratories to give us that flexibility to respond to climate change. If we look at who the companies are, who are the big companies that are going to feed the world? Last year we produced a report, it's on our website, I'll refer you to it, it's free, it's titled Who Owns Nature? It looks at who the major companies are. Boils down to, we said last year, the top 10 seed companies on the planet had 67% of the global commercial proprietary seed market. 67%, just 10 companies. We also said that 4 companies actually made up 50% of the global commercial proprietary seed market. Just 4 companies. Now I can tell you it's 3 companies make up more than 50%, and it keeps on changing. More and more concentration in the seed system. And what are those companies breeding? Well, we talked to Monsanto. Yes, they have their finger in a lot of crops. Almost all of their research energy is going into maize, soybeans, and cotton. That's true for the other major companies, for the DuPonts and the Syngentas of the planet as well. A handful of crops for the major growing areas. During the course of all of the last 50 years of plant breeding, they haven't introduced a single new species into the food system. What have small farmers done during that time? During the same time period, small farmers have worked on, this is the most conservative estimate I can come across, 105 major crop species. Each one of those 105 species contributes at least 5% of the calories in at least one country. They're the only breeders. Farmers are the only breeders in most of those crops. But in reality, a report that's coming out from FAO in October next month, in reality, they've been breeding in about 1,000 crops, according to FAO. So we're putting our trust for climate change, in the food crisis we're about to meet, much worse than it is today. We're going to put our trust in those handful of companies that did a bad job of giving us a handful of crops. We're going to put our trust in the 382 million labs that are producing 1,000 crops. Much greater diversity.